You can put the phone down. Nobody on the other end of it is coming. Read me the date on the third line. That store was closed that Tuesday. It has been closed every Tuesday for 14 months. I wrote the schedule. Now say it again, but say it to the panel. The object at the center of this story is a single sheet of paper, a receiving log printed on cheap thermal stock, 11 lines highlighted in yellow, curling slightly at the corner from the humidity of a room where 22 people were breathing and no one was talking. It smelled faintly of toner and wet umbrellas. It had traveled in the bottom of a canvas tote bag, under a chest clock and a plastic container of half-eaten rice, for 9 days before anyone looked at it, and when someone finally did, a woman who had spent 3 years being introduced as the family's disappointment stopped being introduced that way at all. Zoe Parrish was 28 years old, coaching chess to 14 children in a borrowed church basement in Dongdaemun and working a register in a store she had once run from the corner office on the 4th floor. Her aunt, Seungjun Yoon, had made a small career out of saying her name and then apologizing for it. At dinners, Zoe was never invited to, in front of relatives who learned to look at their plates. What none of them understood was that the mistake they could not stop punishing her for had also taught her exactly how a stolen inventory scheme breathes, and that she would recognize it on sight, in a hearing room, on the 12th floor, with a typhoon warning blinking red on every screen in the corridor. So what does a woman do when the only weapon she has ever been handed is the shape of her own failure? If this story meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me what you would have said to him in that last room if it had been you standing there. I read every single one. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications, and I promise the next story will be even harder to walk away from. Thank you for watching until the very end. I will see you in the next one. Stay with this one, because the highlighted receiving log is only the beginning. And this story does not end the way you think it will. There is a man in it who is 25 years old, who once played professional volleyball in front of 18,000 people, who now runs a sports broadcasting empire from behind a standing desk that everyone in Seoul calls his signature presentation style. Nobody at that company knows why he never sits down. So he found out on a Thursday, by accident, and said nothing about it for 6 weeks. She had come from a Section 8 apartment complex in Fayetteville, 1 block from a record shop with a broken screen door, and she had built something out of nothing at all. And no one in her family saw it coming because no one in her family had looked at her directly since 2021. Here is my question for you before we go back to the beginning. When the room finally goes quiet and everyone is waiting for you to prove you are not what they said you were, do you take the revenge or do you take the record? 7 weeks before the room on the 12th floor went quiet, Zoe Parrish was on her knees on a linoleum floor in a church basement in Dongdaemun, resetting a chess clock with a cracked plastic face because the batteries kept sliding loose, and she had learned that a folded gum wrapper held them in place for about 40 minutes. That was long enough for a game. Most things in her life by then were measured in whether they would hold for the length of one game. The basement smelled of instant coffee, radiator dust, and the particular mustiness of hymnals that have absorbed 30 years of humidity. There were 14 folding chairs, 7 tables pushed into a horseshoe, and 4 chess sets that matched plus 3 that did not. So 2 of the pawns in the 3rd set were a thimble and a bottle cap. Nobody complained. On Tuesdays, the pastor let her have the room from 4 in the afternoon until 6:30, and she had never once been late. Zoe Parrish was 28 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, raised in a Section 8 apartment complex 1 block from a record shop with a broken screen door that slapped shut on a 2 count. She had lived in Seoul for 6 years. She coached 14 children in that basement, ages 7 through 13, and she knew all 14 of their opening habits the way a mother knows which stair creaks. Minseo was 9 years old and losing. She sat with her hands under her thighs, which she did when she was about to do something reckless, and Zoe crouched beside her chair and did not look at the board. "Don't move yet," Zoe said quietly. "Count what you still have." "A rook and 3 pawns. That's more than nothing. Nothing is what you'll have if you move because you're embarrassed." Minseo's hands came out from under her legs. She sat for 22 seconds without touching a piece, and then she pushed a pawn 1 square, which was not a brilliant move, but it was a decision instead of an apology. And Zoe let herself take 1 slow breath through her nose. The children did not know this about their coach, and almost nobody in the building knew it either. 3 years earlier, she had run a retail division from a corner office on the 4th floor of a building 11 subway stops west of that basement, with 6 stores under her and a signature that mattered on paper. She had written schedules that closed every location on Tuesdays, a decision the regional office had fought her on for 3 weeks before the numbers made them stop. She had known the cost of every pallet that came through the back door. She had known which suppliers padded, and by how much, and on which weeks. And then she had walked out, 41 days before fiscal close, without explaining herself to a single member of her family, and a partnership had collapsed behind her, and 2 of her cousins had lost work. She had never told them why. That was the mistake, as far as the family was concerned. Not the walking out. The silence afterward. She filed it with the other things she had chosen not to defend. Ki-hoon Baek had been the store manager for 14 months, and he liked to say her name with a small pause in front of it, the way you say the name of a dog that used to bite. Zoe clocked in at 4:15 on Wednesdays and stood at register 2, which faced the door, which meant she got the wet air off the street every time someone came in, and the specific chemical brightness of the floor cleaner they used at 9. She wore the polo, she wore the name tag. She had worked that register for 14 months and had never once corrected a customer who assumed she had always been there. What she could not stop doing was seeing. She saw that the seasonal end cap had been rebuilt by someone who did not know the sell-through data, because the fastest moving item in that store was priced at 3,900 won and had been buried at ankle height behind a display of imported crackers that moved 4 units a week. On her 3rd shift, she had quietly restacked it. On her 4th shift, sales on that end cap went up by a number she was not supposed to know, because the system still logged her old employee code to the daily summary email and nobody had ever thought to remove her. She did not mention it. She let it keep arriving, every morning at 6:04, a small gray rectangle of information on a phone with a cracked corner. She had no idea yet what she was going to need it for. Seungjun Yoon came into the store at 9:41 on a Thursday night, 8 weeks before the typhoon, wearing a coat that cost more than the shelving it walked past, and he bought a bottle of unsweetened barley tea, a pack of cotton pads, and a roll of medical tape. Zoe rang him up in 11 seconds without looking at the keypad. He noticed that. She could tell he noticed because he stopped, and his eyes went from her hands to the end cap behind her, and then back to her hands, in that order. And the order was the thing. Most people looked at your face. He had looked at what her hands had just done, then at the thing in the room that did not match the rest of the room, and then he had gone back to her hands because he had figured out that both facts belonged to the same person. "You built that display," he said. "I straightened it." "You reversed it." The high-margin item was buried, and now it's at eye level, and the crackers are on the bottom shelf where they belong. He set his card on the counter, face down, which was a small, strange courtesy she did not understand until much later. "Who signs off on planograms here?" "Not me." "That was not what I asked." She looked up then, fully, for the first time. He was younger than the coat. Somewhere around 25, with the shoulders of someone whose body had been an instrument in a previous life, and the stillness of someone who had learned to hold himself very carefully in the present one. He was standing 3 feet from her with his weight shifted almost entirely onto his left leg, and every 40 seconds or so he moved it. A small transfer, not fidgeting, more like a man turning a page. 9,701, so he said. Seungjun Yoon smiled with about a quarter of his mouth and paid and picked up his bag and did not leave. "Your accent is Southern American," he said. "Georgia?" "North Carolina. You count change without looking down. That takes about 2 years behind a register, or it takes a woman who used to audit the drawer at closing and never got out of the habit." He let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. I'd guess the second one. Zoe held his eyes and said nothing. He accepted the nothing. That was the part she thought about later, on the bus, with the plastic bag of her own dinner on her lap. He had asked, she had refused, and he had not pushed, and he had not been offended, and he had not tried to make her small for the pleasure of watching it work. He said, "Have a good night," and walked out into the wet, and did not once look back at the door to see if she was watching him go, which she was. Now, this is the part I would like you to hold on to, because she would not let herself hold on to it for another 6 weeks. The medical tape was not for a finger. Seungjun Yoon arrived 9 days later, on a Saturday, at 2:20 in the afternoon, in a camel coat with a scarf arranged the way people arrange scarves when they expect to be photographed by no one and dress for it anyway. She was Zoe's aunt. She was 5 feet 2 inches of absolute, well-moisturized certainty, and she held the family's franchise stake, which meant she held Ki Hoon-baek's job, which meant she held Zoe's. She came to register too with 2 other women, both from the church her side of the family attended, and she did not buy anything, and she said, in Korean, loudly enough for the aisle behind her, "This is my niece, the American one, you remember." One of the women made a small, polite sound. "She works here now," Seungjun said. "At the front. It is good for her. Honest work. After what she did, honest work is the best thing for a person." The fluorescent light above Register 2 had a flicker in it, 3 pulses every minute or so, and Zoe found herself counting them. "Aunt," she said, "can I get you a bag?" "You know she was in the newspaper," Seungjun told the women, not turning her head. "Not the good part of the newspaper." "There's a promotion on the barley tea," Zoe said. 2 for 3,000. "Do you know what it is to explain your own family to people?" Seungjun said, and there it was, the thing she had come 40 minutes across the city to say, delivered in that pleasant, lifted tone she used for everything, the same tone she used for compliments and for weather. Every year, at every table, to explain that we had one who could not carry the name. The 2 women had begun to study the gum rack with tremendous focus. Zoe said, "All right." 2 words, flat, no heat in them at all. And somewhere behind her sternum, a door she had been holding open for 3 years swung shut on a soft click. Seungjun Yoon had been erasing her by inches since 2021. It was not a campaign of threats. It was administrative. Zoe was not invited to the New Year gathering, or to the memorial for her uncle, or to the lunch after her cousin's wedding, and when a photograph went into the family album, she was cropped at the shoulder. And when relatives visited from Busan, they were told she was busy. Nobody in that family had looked at her directly in 3 years. They had all become extremely skilled at addressing the space 6 inches to the left of her head. The aunt's actual power was small, if you laid it out on a table. A franchise stake, a phone tree, a seat at the good end of a rented banquet room. But small power applied to one person for 3 years is not small. At 5:50 that same afternoon, Zoe's phone lit with a number from Taebaek. Her grandmother had been at a sanatorium up in those mountains for 8 months, in a low white building with a view of ridge lines that went blue by 4 in the afternoon, recovering from a stroke that had taken most of her right side and none of her opinions. Zoe had visited 11 times. She had taken the 7:20 train and brought persimmons and sat and read to her from the sports pages, because her grandmother liked the volleyball results and could no longer hold the paper. The nurse on the phone was careful in the way people are careful when they have been instructed and do not agree with the instruction. "Miss Parrish, I have to tell you that the visitor list has been revised." Revised. Immediate family and authorized parties. I'm sorry, your name is not on it as of Thursday. Zoe stood in the stockroom doorway with the receiver of her own life pressed to her ear and looked at a stack of shrink-wrapped water bottles. "Who authorized it?" "I'm not able to say." "That's all right," Zoe said. "I know." She had no proof. She filed it with the other things she had no proof of. The letter came 4 days after that, in an envelope with the crest of the Seoul family court, and Zoe read it standing up in the church basement with 14 children playing behind her and a radiator knocking like something trapped in the wall. Seungjun had petitioned for sole legal guardianship of Halmeoni. The filing included a statement regarding the character and fitness of other potential guardians and interested parties. Zoe was named on page 2, in the section for persons whose involvement the petitioner considered detrimental to the ward's welfare. There was a hearing date, room 1204, 12th floor. She read it twice. Then she folded it into thirds and put it in the bottom of the canvas tote bag, under the chess clock, and turned around, because Minseo was calling her. "Coach, is this a bad move?" Zoe looked at the board for 6 seconds. "It's a fine move," she said. "But look at what he's doing on the other side while you're proud of it." Behind her, on every screen in the corridor upstairs, a weather advisory was starting to blink, the first edge of a storm still 3 days out over the water. She did not know yet that a man who could not sit down was already reading the same board she was. The storm that had been 3 days out came ashore on a Friday and turned out to be almost nothing. 41 millimeters of rain, one bent umbrella in the gutter outside the store, a wind that pulled the awning halfway loose and then apologized. The one behind it, still forming over warm water 900 miles south, was the one that would eventually get a name. Zoe had 5 weeks and 2 days before room 1204. Jinhee was her cousin by marriage, 31 years old, the only person in that family who had ever looked at Zoe's actual face since 2021, and she did it in the way people look at a stove they are not sure is off. On a Sunday morning, Jinhee sent a text with no greeting in it, just an address in Junggu, a banquet hall on the 3rd floor, and a time, 12:30. Then, 4 minutes later, a second message, Halmeoni's 80th. Nobody told me not to tell you. They were holding an 80th birthday celebration for a woman who was 190 miles away in a white building in Taebaek with a paralyzed right hand. The plan, Zoe learned later, was a video call. They gave it 4 minutes, and then somebody's toddler needed the phone. Zoe went anyway. She bought persimmons because that was what she brought, 6 of them, the firm kind her grandmother liked, in a brown paper bag from the market by the station, and she wore the gray dress she had bought in a previous life for a supplier negotiation in Busan, and she rode the elevator up with 2 of her uncle's colleagues who did not know who she was and were therefore perfectly kind to her. Seungjun was standing at the sign-in table in a jade-colored jacket with a corsage pinned to it. There was a list on the table, an actual list, printed in a plastic sleeve, and Zoe understood with a strange detached admiration that her aunt had made a list for a family party in a rented room where everyone had known everyone since birth. "Your name is not on this," Seungjun said. The hall behind her held maybe 34 people, and the noise in it dropped the way noise drops in a room where something is about to be enjoyed. "I brought these for her," Zoe said, "for when someone drives up." "You understand what you are doing?" Soyeon's voice lifted into that pleasant register, the one she used for weather. "You come to a celebration for an old woman, and you make yourself the subject of it. This is what she does," she said, turning slightly, to the room, to the aunties, to a second cousin holding a plate of fruit. "This is the shame of this family, and she cannot even let a birthday be a birthday." Somebody's chair scraped. Nobody stood up. Zoe looked past her aunt at the far wall, where a photograph of her grandmother from 1994 had been blown up and mounted on foam board, and in that photograph her grandmother was holding a small child's hand, and the child had been cropped out at the wrist. She set the paper bag down on the gift table, between 2 boxes wrapped in gold, and she said, "All right." Then she walked back to the elevator and rode down 3 floors, and stood on the street in air that smelled like wet asphalt and fried batter, and did not cry, because she had learned in a Section 8 apartment complex in Fayetteville that you do your crying in a room with a door. What she would not let herself feel for another 5 weeks was this. It was not the list. It was that the persimmons stayed on that table all afternoon, and nobody moved them, and nobody drove them up the mountain, and by 6 that evening, a caterer put them in a bin with the leftover fruit plates. Dahi Lim ran a legal aid office out of 2 rooms above a print shop in Sindang, and she talked the way people talk when they have 60 cases and 1 assistant. "Guardianship is not about you," she said. "I need you to hear that first, because everything else I say is going to sound like it is about you." She had the petition open, tabbed with 3 colors of sticky note. "The court decides who manages your grandmother's person and her property. Your aunt is asking for both. The section that names you is not a charge. It is a recommendation to the court. That is worse, in a way, because you cannot answer a recommendation the way you answer a charge. What happens if the judge accepts it? Then it goes in the order. Contact conditions, visitation restrictions, sometimes a specific finding. Facilities follow the order." She said it without softening it, and Zoe was grateful and made a note to remember that she had been grateful. The visitor list at that sanatorium stops being your aunt's decision and becomes the court's. Those get reviewed on petition. In practice, they do not get reviewed. Zoe sat with the radiator noise and the smell of toner coming up through the floor from the print shop. "So I would not see her again." "You would not see her again," Dahi Lim said. That was the size of it, laid flat. A woman who could no longer hold a newspaper, and a granddaughter who took the 7:20 train, and a piece of paper on the 12th floor that could put 190 miles between them permanently, filed by an aunt with a corsage. What can I actually do? 2 things. The attorney held up a finger. You file a response. You can attach a statement. It will be read by a clerk and skimmed by a judge, and every party in that room will have a statement saying the opposite of yours. And I'm telling you now that statements are almost worthless. Second finger. Or you request records. A petitioner asking for authority over the ward's property has to account for the ward's property. Your grandmother owns the franchise stake. Your aunt holds it on her behalf. She has held it since the stroke. Zoe stopped moving. "Held it," she said. "Managed it." "Signed for it. Voted it." Dahi Lim turned a page. If you ask the court to compel an accounting, the court can subpoena the operating records of any asset in the estate. Not because you want them, because the estate is the court's business. There is a deadline. Evidence has to be submitted to the panel 10 days before the hearing date, or it does not exist. Who decides what gets subpoenaed? You request, the judge decides. The attorney looked up over her glasses. Do not request everything. Judges hate fishing. Request one thing you can name. Zoe walked out onto the street and stood there for a while with her tote bag on her shoulder, and inside the tote bag was a chess clock held together with a gum wrapper and a plastic container and a folded letter and a phone that received a small gray email every morning at 6:04. Request one thing you can name. The Chowan building had 41 floors and a lobby with a stone floor so polished that Zoe could see the underside of her own shoes in it. And she arrived 14 minutes early because she always arrived 14 minutes early. And that is how she found out. The pastor had forwarded her the inquiry 6 days before. A community sponsorship program, youth sports and mind sports, application deadline, up to 4 million won for equipment and space rental. She had filled out the form at the kitchen table at 1 in the morning and put in a photograph of the 3rd chess set with the thimble and the bottle cap in it, because she had decided a long time ago that if she was going to ask for money, she was going to be accurate about why. They put her in a corridor on the 38th floor and told her someone would come. She got restless, and there was a door marked with a room number and no name, and it was open 4 inches, and she pushed it because she thought it was the meeting room. Seungjun Yoon was on the floor, flat on his back on the carpet with his knees up over a chair seat and his suit jacket folded across his chest like a blanket, one arm over his eyes. There was a roll of medical tape on the carpet beside his head. His shirt had pulled up 2 inches at the waist, and she could see the bottom of a scar there, a raised pale line running up out of his belt into the shadow of the cloth. The kind of scar that does not come from an accident, but from a surgeon who needed a great deal of room. He did not hear her. She counted 1 second and then closed the door to exactly where it had been, 4 inches, and went and stood by the window and looked at Namsan Tower until a woman with a tablet came for her. 18 minutes later, he walked into the meeting room from the other end of the hall, upright, unhurried, and stood behind a standing desk. They had wheeled in for him, and 6 people in that room called it his signature presentation style, with the particular pride of employees repeating a thing they have decided is charming. He asked her 11 questions about the chess club and 2 about herself. He asked how many children, and their ages, and how many showed up in February when it was cold, and whether she had ever lost one and why, and when she said a boy had stopped coming in April because his mother started a night shift and there was no one to walk him home. Seungjun Yoon wrote that down in a small notebook by hand. Then he said, "The family court envelope in your bag has been opened and refolded more than twice." Zoe looked at him. "I'm not asking," he said. "Good. You did not tell me anything about yourself when I asked you at the register either." He capped his pen. "You will get the sponsorship. It is 4 million won, and my company will spend more than that on catering this quarter, so please do not thank me for it in a way that costs you anything." That was the joke. It took her until the elevator to notice it had been won. He shifted his weight off his left leg, once, the way a man turns a page. And Zoe Parrish, 28 years old, who had just seen the whole architecture of this man's dignity lying on a carpet with its shirt untucked, said, "Thank you for your time," and said, "Thank you for your time," and did not mention the carpet or the tape or the scar or the 18 minutes he had needed to make himself into a man who could walk into a room. She held that for 6 weeks. It cost her something to hold it. You will have to take my word for that, because she never once let it show on her face. Yongbin Distribution was the name on the top of every page of the packet that arrived at Dae-Lim's office on a Wednesday in a banker's box with a court seal on the lid, and it was the only name in the whole business that Zoe Parrish had not expected to see. She had requested one thing she could name. Not the bank records, not the phone logs, not the aunt's tax filings or the sanatorium invoices or any of the 7 other things a person in her position would have grabbed for. She had requested the receiving logs of the franchise store, all 6 locations, 14 months, and the corresponding supplier invoices, because the store was an asset of her grandmother's estate and the court had every right in the world to look at how it was being run. The judge had granted it in a single line, without comment, the way judges grant boring things. Zoe put the box in the church basement under the table with the mismatched chess set on it, and then she did something she could not entirely explain to herself. She did not open it. For 9 days it sat there while she coached, and she carried the top sheaf of it around in her canvas tote bag under the cracked chess clock and a plastic container of half-eaten rice, and she went to work, and she rang up barley tea at 3,900 won, and she said good evening to Ki-hoon Baek, and every morning at 6:04 the small gray email arrived on the phone with the cracked corner, and she read it standing at the bus stop. Why did she wait? She was 28 years old, and she had already learned the most expensive lesson of her life, which is that once you know a thing, you cannot unknow it, and once you say it out loud in a room with 22 people in it, you are responsible for everything that happens next. On the 9th night she came home, sat on the floor with her back against the radiator, and read 41 pages. It took her 11 minutes. What she saw, nobody else in this story could have seen. Not Dae-Lim with her 60 cases, not the court's own accountant, not a prosecutor. Yongbin Distribution delivered to the franchise stores on a rotating schedule. Their invoices were clean, their pallet counts were clean. The receiving logs at the store on the 4th floor building, the one Zoe had run, the one Ki-hoon Baek had managed for 14 months, showed 11 deliveries received and signed for on Tuesdays. The store was closed every Tuesday. It had been closed every Tuesday for 14 months. Zoe had written that schedule herself, and she had fought the regional office for 3 weeks to get it. And she had won because the numbers made them stop arguing. 11 deliveries received on 11 days when there was nobody in the building to receive anything. That is the whole shape of it. Goods invoiced to the estate store, signed in on a day when no employee was on the clock, entered into the inventory system as received, and then written down 3 weeks later as spoilage or damage in transit at a rate no auditor looks at twice, because spoilage is boring and everybody expects some. The stock never came. The money went out. Somebody's cousin's company on the other end of it kept the difference, and somebody in the middle signed the log, and the person who voted the stake and approved the accounts never had to touch a pen. Zoe had known suppliers who padded. She had known which weeks they did it. She had spent 3 years in a corner office learning the exact sound this made, and then she had walked out of that office 41 days before fiscal close because she had refused to sign off on something very close to it, and she had never once explained that to a single member of her family. That was the mistake they could not stop punishing her for. She took a yellow highlighter out of the jar where the children kept theirs, and she marked 11 lines, and the ink bled a little on the cheap thermal stock. Evidence had to be with the panel 10 days before the hearing, or it did not exist. She filed it the next morning with 21 hours to spare, and then she went to work and stood at register 2 and watched the fluorescent light pulse 3 times a minute above her head, and said nothing at all to Ki-hoon Baek, who asked her twice if she was feeling all right. The typhoon got its name on a Thursday and made landfall on the coast the following Monday. And by the morning of the hearing, the whole city smelled like wet concrete and cut leaves. Every screen in the 12th floor corridor of the Dongdaemun family court building carried the same red advisory, blinking, silent, all the way down the hall past the vending machine and the plastic ficus and the row of chairs bolted to the floor. Room 1204. Zoe arrived 14 minutes early because she always arrived 14 minutes early, and she stood at the window and watched the rain come across the rooftops in sheets like something being dragged. 22 people. She counted them. 3 panel members at the front, the presiding judge in the center chair, a court clerk, a recording officer, Soyeonguk's counsel, a man in a suit from a firm with a marble reception desk, and beside him her aunt in the jade-colored jacket. No corsage this time. Ki-hoon Baek, subpoenaed, in the second row with his hands flat on his thighs. 2 relatives from Busan. Jin-hee, sitting by herself at the end of a row, who had come without telling anyone. And at the back, standing, because he could not do otherwise, Seungjun Yoon. He had no business being there. He had a network that broadcast to 4 continents and a schedule managed in 15-minute blocks. And he had come to a guardianship hearing on the 12th floor of a municipal building in the rain and stood at the back wall like a man waiting for a bus. He found her in the corridor at 9:52, 8 minutes before they opened the doors. Yongbin Distribution holds a beverage licensing contract with 2 of my regional sports properties, he said. It is worth about 900 million won a year to them. I could end it before lunch with a phone call, and I could make sure the reason was known to every buyer in this city by Friday. Zoe looked at him. Your aunt's second son sits on their board, he said. You did not know that. I did. I have known it for 5 weeks. He did not say the rest of it, and she would not learn it for another 11 days. He had been standing for 41 minutes by then. The fusion in his lower spine had begun doing the thing it did. A slow, bright pressure spreading out from the hardware like water finding the low point in a floor. And he had a roll of medical tape in his coat pocket and a car downstairs with the seat already reclined, and he had calculated that he could give this 90 minutes before his left leg stopped being reliable. He had done that arithmetic in the elevator. He was 25 years old, and he did that arithmetic 6 or 7 times a day, and had never once let a room see him do it. He had watched a woman close a door back to exactly 4 inches, and had understood, lying on that carpet with his shirt untucked, that she had given him the only gift anybody had given him in 3 years, which was the choice of when to be seen. He was offering her the same thing back, a door she could close. Don't, Zoe said. It would work. I know it would work. She adjusted the tote bag on her shoulder. And for the rest of my life, the story would be that a man made a phone call for me. He was quiet. "They have spent 3 years telling that room I could not carry the name," she said. "If you fix this, they get to keep saying it. They just say it about a different thing." Seungjun Yoon looked at her for about 4 seconds. "All right," he said, and put his hands in his coat pockets and went and stood at the back wall and did not say one word for the next hour and 20 minutes. The hearing was not dramatic. I want to be honest with you about that, because the room where a life turns is almost never dramatic. There were sworn statements read into the record in a flat administrative voice. There was a discussion of the ward's medical status and a physician's report, and a discussion of the ward's assets, and So Young-guk's counsel described his client's 8 months of devoted management of the family franchise stake in a tone you would use for a woman who had personally carried her mother up a mountain. Then Dahi Lim stood up, in a jacket that did not match her skirt, holding one sheet of paper. "Your Honor, the petitioner asks for authority over the ward's property. The record contains an accounting of that property submitted at the court's order. I would ask the panel to hear from the store manager regarding 11 entries in it." So Young-guk took out her phone and set it on the table in front of her and began, quite openly, to type. Zoe watched her do it. Then she leaned over to Dae-lim and said something, and Dae-lim said something to the clerk, and the presiding judge said, "Miss Parrish, you may address the witness on this exhibit directly." Zoe stood up. She had a phone with a cracked corner in her pocket and a chest clock in her bag held together with a folded gum wrapper, and she was wearing the gray dress she had bought in another life for a supplier negotiation in Busan. "You can put the phone down," she said, not to Ki-hoon Baek. "Nobody on the other end of it is coming." So Young-guk's hand stopped. Zoe turned to the second row and held up the sheet, curling at the corner from the humidity of a room where 22 people were breathing, 11 lines highlighted in yellow. "Mr. Beck, read me the date on the third line." He read it. "What day of the week was that?" He did not answer. "It was a Tuesday," Zoe said, and her voice did not go up at all. "That store was closed that Tuesday. It has been closed every Tuesday for 14 months. I wrote the schedule." The recording officer's fingers kept moving. That was the only sound. "There are 11 of them," Zoe said. 11 deliveries signed as received on days when the doors were locked and the alarm was armed and there was nobody in the building. Every one of those pallets was entered into inventory at full cost and written off 3 weeks later as transit damage. The goods never existed. The invoices did. Yongbin Distribution was paid 4 times out of the ward's store account for stock that was never delivered, and the accounts that authorized those payments were approved by the holder of the stake. "Now say it again," the presiding judge said, "but say it to the panel." So she turned and faced 3 people she had never met and said it again, slowly, line by line, dates and amounts, in the flattest voice she owned. When she finished, So Young-guk's counsel asked for a recess and got 15 minutes. And in that corridor, with the red advisory blinking on every screen and the rain going sideways past the window, Zoe Parrish did the thing that this entire story exists in order to tell you about. She told Dahi-lim to strike the paragraph about the sanatorium. There was one. Zoe had written it and never filed it. Her aunt had moved 6 million won out of the store account in March, and the sanatorium invoice for that quarter had been paid 41 days late, and Zoe could prove both, and she had spent one whole night on the floor of her apartment deciding what to do with it. "That is the one that finishes her," Dae-lim said. "That is the one that finishes her in the newspaper," Zoe said. "I did not come here to take her apart. I came here so a judge would put in writing that I am allowed to sit next to my grandmother and read her the volleyball results." Then she said the other thing, and Dae-lim actually put her pen down. "And I am not asking the court to appoint me. Ask them for a professional guardian, someone neutral, court-supervised, with reporting requirements. Zoe, you would win." "I know," Zoe said. "That is not the same as being right." The doors opened at 11:06. The presiding judge said the panel would take the guardianship petition and the accounting irregularities under advisement, that a referral would be made to the appropriate office, and that a decision would issue in writing. Then she said, "Not today," and stood, and the room began to move. At the back wall, a man who had been standing for 79 minutes shifted his weight off his left leg, once, the way a man turns a page. The written decision came 11 days later, in an envelope thinner than the first one. The panel declined to appoint Seongguk. A professional guardian was appointed instead, court-supervised, with quarterly reporting on the ward's person and the ward's property, and the accounting irregularities were referred to the prosecutor's office for review. On page 3, in a single line with no adjectives in it, the order stated that the ward's granddaughter, Zoe Parrish, was to have unrestricted visitation. Her aunt kept her house, her church, her phone tree, and her name. She was not charged with anything that year. But the referral existed, and referrals are read by people who talk. And by the following New Year, the seating at the good end of the rented banquet room had rearranged itself in a way nobody explained out loud. Relatives from Busan asked careful questions. The woman who had made a printed list for a family party became, over about 14 months, a subject rather than a voice, discussed quietly at the exact gatherings where she had once done the discussing. Zoe did not attend any of them. On the second Tuesday after the decision, Seungjun Yoon came down the stairs into the church basement at 5:40 in the afternoon, in a coat that cost more than the building's boiler, carrying 2 boxes of chess clocks with batteries that stayed in on their own. Minseo beat him in 19 moves. He asked her to show him where he had lost it, and she did, and he wrote it in the small notebook by hand. Afterward, when the children had gone and the folding chairs were stacked, he stood by the radiator with his weight on his left leg and told her the rest of it. 5 weeks before the hearing, your aunt's second son came to my office, he said. He wanted a favor. He wanted a broadcast partnership announced in a way that would make his mother look substantial in front of certain people. He mentioned as a courtesy that there was a difficult niece. Zoe put down the box she was holding. I said no in about 6 seconds, he said. Then I spent 5 weeks finding out who the difficult niece was. You already knew. I already knew. He shifted his weight. I have never in my life watched somebody hand back a weapon that was already in her hand. I wanted to see if you would do it twice. And? You did it 3 times. You struck your own best paragraph. He looked at the horseshoe of tables, the third set with the thimble and the bottle cap. I have people who tell me I am the smartest man in every room I enter. You are the first person who has made me want to check. She pulled a folding chair out of the stack, opened it, and set it down 3 feet from where he stood, facing him. She did not say anything about it. She did not look at his back or his belt or the place where the scar went up under his shirt. He looked at the chair for 5 seconds. Then he sat down in it, in front of her, in a church basement that smelled of instant coffee and radiator dust, and let out a breath he had been holding for 3 years. Okay, so he said. That was all. She went back to stacking chairs, and he stayed sitting, and neither of them mentioned it again for a long time. 10 days later, she took the 7:20 train to Taebaek with 6 firm persimmons in a brown paper bag, and her name was on the list at the desk, printed in a plastic sleeve. She sat on the right side of the bed, where her grandmother could see her without turning, and read her the volleyball results out loud, all of them, including the standings, because her grandmother liked the standings. She had learned, in a Section 8 apartment complex 1 block from a record shop with a broken screen door, that you do your crying behind a door and your arithmetic in daylight. She had learned, in a corner office on the 4th floor, that the fastest way to lose a family is to refuse to explain yourself, and that some silences are worth what they cost. She had learned, in a room with 22 people breathing in it, that there is a difference between winning and being right, and that only one of them lets you sleep. And she had learned that the most powerful man she would ever meet did not want to be admired. He wanted to be allowed to sit down. If this story meant something to you, Drop a comment and tell me what you would have said to him in that corridor when he offered to end it with one phone call. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. And I promise the next story will be even harder to walk away from. Thank you for watching until the very end. I will see you in the next one.